I'm delighted today to be joined by two experts, Yuliya Ziskina and Timothy Ash. We're going to be talking about the frozen Russian assets. And you'll know we've done several interviews on this topic already. And it is a source of immense frustration that these funds have not been handed over to Ukraine at this point. And we've litigated why that is and why they should be handed over. The trouble is there is a deadline approaching where Russia may get their hands on these funds again, and that would be an absolutely disastrous step that should be avoided if at all possible. That's going to be the core topic of our discussion today. Yuliya Ziskina is a policy and advocacy attorney specializing in information policy and public international law, and she's from Ukraine and is currently based in the New York City Metropolitan Area. Timothy Ash has been a professional economist for more than 30 years, with two-thirds of that in the banking industry. His specialism is emerging European economics, and he writes and blogs extensively on the economic challenges for leading publications such as Kyiv Post, Atlantic Council, Financial Times, etc. And if anyone has followed his prodigious output, they'll know he is extremely pro-Ukraine, but also brings incredible expertise to the economic aspect of the war. He's also an expert on Turkey, which you'll have heard us talk about that as well, which plays an interesting role. We're going to jump straight into this because this is an incredibly important topic. Yuliya, why is it important to talk about this now? And what is this looming deadline that is coming up?
Sure. Thank you first of all, thank you for having me on the show again. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad that you pointed that out because so far in the war, there has been this assumption and stated assumption that these frozen assets will remain frozen until the end of the war, until Russia pays, whenever that might be. But that is fundamentally untrue. That is a false assumption. And that's because the EU needs to renew its sanctions every 6 months. So just to backtrack a little bit, following the full-scale invasion, the EU adopted sanctions packages against Russia. The two main ones being via council decision. One was sectoral economic measures, which kept the central bank assets frozen. And another is the council decision to keep frozen the about 2,000 or so individuals, companies, oligarchs, private assets. So here we're talking mostly about the central bank reserves, but both of these need to be renewed every 6 months. In order to renew them, the EU must vote unanimously. That means all 27 member states, including Hungary and Slovakia. So in the past, it has already been very difficult to gain this unanimous consent, especially when Hungary has almost every single time threatened to veto, demanding severe concessions. And so with this upcoming deadline, which needs to be renewed on July 31st, we have the wild card of the Trump administration potentially emboldening Hungary and Slovakia. And who knows what will happen this time on July 31st. The problem being is that if those sanctions are not renewed, if that asset freeze is not renewed, the 200 or so billion in the EU's jurisdiction, that could go straight back to Russia. The sanctions lapse, the Central Bank of Russia could make a claim on its deposit, and there would be nothing stopping 200 billion reverting back to the Russian Federation.
Now, you've long argued, Tim, that these funds need to be used not just in Ukraine reconstruction, but in actually helping Ukraine be resilient against the Russian aggression. And that includes not just military spending, but supporting essential services, fire, police, and all the other things that are kind of going on. Doesn't this become even more critical with the loss of things like USAID, the withdrawal of the US from multiple programs, including the one that got some coverage, which is the Yale program to repatriate abducted Ukrainian children? Isn't it more important than ever that these funds are actually used to help Ukraine survive, let alone achieve some kind of victory?
Well, the reconstruction costs are enormous. There's been various estimates, and I think the World Bank probably at something like half a trillion and counting. The costs of maintaining the war are also enormous in terms of fiscal and military support. It runs around 100 billion a year. Obviously, the Americans had been providing about 40% of that total. That seems very unlikely. Well, we've not been getting very much from the Americans post the Trump administration. There is a shortfall there. It can, I think, be made up from by the Europeans. I mean, if you think of the size of the European economy, but I think there are lots of different issues here. I mean, one is the fact that the aggressor should be made to pay. A country has violated international law by taking territory, crossing borders, waging war, causing human and economic damage. There needs to be reparations, right? And it will be more difficult, I think, if these assets are given back to Russia. Russia obviously will play hardball, not to pay those reparations. Obviously, there's a peace process ongoing. The Trump administration. There's concern about whether or not immobilized Russian assets will be part of that process. Whether some, maybe in the Trump administration, we've even heard President Macron suggest that somehow, their availability could be somehow a negotiating ploy. Well, if they're a negotiating ploy, it means that some people in G7 think that that money is going to go back. Now, if it does go back to Russia and Russia doesn't pay reparations, then G7 or Western countries are on the hook for the reconstruction costs, you would assume, right? So again, it's just how is that fair? How is that justified that the aggressor is not made to pay? Why should European taxpayers, assuming the Americans, European taxpayers, and I assume Canada, Japan, non-US Western taxpayers end up paying the bill for Russia's actions in Ukraine and helping Ukraine defend itself and defend Europe against our aggression? So I mean, there's so many issues that involved here. But if the assets go back to Russia, it makes it all the more difficult.
So, Yuliya, would you see this 200 billion as really more of a down payment against the huge sums of money that have been incurred and continue to be incurred by the war? Not, even the human cost, notwithstanding the material cost alone to keep Ukraine's resistance going. This is not a drop in the ocean, but it's just a down payment on the total that Ukraine deserves.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the World Bank and other international organizations have already estimated that Russia owes a debt of 524 billion in reconstruction costs. That is only the reconstruction costs. That does not include compensation to victims who have been tortured, lost their lives, limbs, relatives. So the amounts are probably closer to the trillions. But we do have this 300 billion that is frozen worldwide. That is essentially a down payment. It is an offset against the debt that Russia owes. This is undisputed in the Western world. It has been recognized by the UN General Assembly, by the International Court of Justice, and many, many other international bodies that Russia owes this debt. That's not up for debate. The question is only, do we enforce that debt, or do we send this money back to the aggressor? And to Timothy's point about making Europeans pay and taxpayers pay, what would happen also is if this money goes back to Russia, then this $50 billion loan, the accelerated revenue or extraordinary revenue acceleration loan, the ERA loan that was fashioned by the G7 in the fall, which uses the revenue stream, the future revenue stream from the frozen assets to repay the loan, that becomes undermined. That loan, that money, 20 billion was fronted by the EU, 20 billion was fronted by the US, and the remaining across other countries. If we lose the principal amount of the assets, there is no revenue stream to be gained from it. And so who's on the hook for that loan? Western taxpayers. So we would not be only giving Russia a bailout for the damage it's caused, we would be paying for it ourselves.
So we're creating a huge liability on ourselves. What are the principal barriers? No, we've both talked about this before, but could we remind the audience what are the principal barriers and have been over this period to handing those funds over? We know that Slovakia and Hungary, of course, are key impediments in doing that, but they're not the only ones preventing these funds from being handed over. Let's start with Tim, and then Yuliya, I'm sure you can list a few more of them.
Well, actually, I don't think there are particular legal or economic barriers. I mean, it's a political will issue. mean, Yuliya and her team have done an incredible job at laying out a foundation for confiscation of assets and I think allocation ultimately to Ukraine. It's there, the legal basis, I think it's there. There's obviously been lots of economic arguments used against use of mobilized Russian assets. I mean, they're various. One of them is, the impact on G7 reserve currencies, that somehow confidence in Western reserve currencies would be undermined by this process, that let's say authoritarian regimes globally would fear that their assets could also be subject to confiscation and they would pull assets out of Western jurisdictions. As I and many other people have argued, there's zero evidence that has happened. I mean, I don't think there's a huge difference between immobilization and confiscation, right? I mean, immobilization put Russia's central bank reserves beyond the reach and beyond the use of the Russian central bank. I mean, that's very painful. Any authoritarian regime, central bank, and authorities would not want that to happen. But that there hasn't been any evidence at all. There's been no change of reserve management away from dollar or euro at all because of this process. And one of the problems is there are simply a lack of alternatives. If you think of global reserve assets, we're talking about, I think something like $10 trillion. They need to be allocated to safe reserve liquid assets, and there simply aren't any beyond, the euro market, the US dollar market, treasuries. And these countries don't trust each other. So it's not as though China is suddenly going to dump a load of its reserves into the ruble, right? So there's no evidence there's been any transfer or because of immobilization. I don't think move to confiscation would make any difference. There aren't simply any alternatives. And I think in the end, if some of those authoritarian regimes want to break international law, invade countries, commit war crimes, maybe, they should be liable to confiscation, right? Maybe they'd be less inclined to do those kind of bad things if there was some potential confiscation in those circumstances. So the economic arguments are fairly weak. There is another one, which is that particularly in Europe, there's been concern of retaliation, right? So that we do it, so that somehow Western assets in Russia's jurisdiction get confiscated. The reality is that's already happened. Russia's already been confiscating Western assets. They're a lot smaller than Russian assets offshore, right? And the other argument is that, if we are concerned that Western assets that ignored Western government advice for a decade to not invest in Russia, but somehow we are defending those assets, we're defending the interests of international Western investors that made their own decision to invest in Russia against the best advice of their own governments, but their interests are being put ahead of our own taxpayer. I think that's a ludicrous suggestion, right? That we should somehow be pulling punches in our own geopolitical interests against an existential threat from Russia because of some greedy Western companies that made bad investment decisions being invested in Russia. So I think that's a very, very weak argument in any event. So I think the economic arguments are pretty weak, frankly, against it. The legal arguments have been put in place by Yuliya already and her team. It's essentially a political decision, right? And there's been a lot of lobbying by Russia and Russian interests against it. I think there are a lot of overly cautious bureaucrats in Western jurisdictions that are stalling the process. I don't know, yes minister, yes prime minister style bureaucrats who hate doing things that are slightly difficult. And sure, it's not. I think doing this is not an optimal scenario, right? But I don't ask what are the alternatives, right? And actually, Yuliya and myself and other people have been arguing for 3 years that this needs to be done. If this had been done, Ukraine would have been in a much better position to defend itself, to buy weapons to defend itself. And those people stalling this process need to ask themselves the counterfactual, right? What happens if we don't provide this money, right? Well, we've seen that Ukraine has been losing. It's been put on the back foot. It's not been in a position where it's been able to defend itself, and it's now going to a peace process where it's on the back foot, right? And in the end, if these assets are not used, Western taxpayer money will have to be used, and how fair is that? And it's an interesting one. I'm sure Yuliya's had the same issue as myself. When you sit down with a Western politician, an MP from the UK, for example, and you explain this to them, and they say, well, it's a choice. Should the Russian taxpayer pay to pay for the destruction of Ukraine, or should UK taxpayers pay for this? And it's like a no-brainer. They say, obviously, the Russian taxpayer should pay, and they're all enthusiastic, and they go away and they then lobby the Treasury, UK Treasury, or the ECB, whatever, and then it gets stuck somewhere. It gets stuck amongst bureaucrats, and I've argued that if ECB members, treasuries, these are not the right kind of people who should be making this decision. This is a national security decision. It's not an ECB decision, right? It should be taken at the highest level of our governments with our national security interests at top of the pile. And again, bottom line, who should pay? Western taxpayers or Russian taxpayers? I think overwhelmingly it should be the Russian taxpayer that pays for the aggression.
Do you see the blockages the same, Yuliya? Is your interpretation that it's the bureaucrats? Are there particular institutions, or are there countries that are actively lobbying against it, such as Hungary and Slovakia, that may prove decisive?
Well, I agree fully with Tim. I wouldn't even call them so much as blockages as false blockages. They are manufactured obstacles and issues, especially as Tim pointed out, the use of law as a barrier of some sort. It's always worth a refresher course, I think, because this is something we always hear. Well, it's illegal. We can't just steal Russia's money. You'll probably see this in the YouTube comments when you post this video. But just to offer a quick answer to that, international law actually does not forbid the use of Russia's assets to support Ukraine's reconstruction, defense. It actually, on the contrary, it allows it. Under the doctrine of countermeasures, as Tim mentioned, international lawyers have established for the past 3 years, including former judges and justices of international courts. When there is a serious breach of international law, countries can take a response to that, provided that those actions are proportionate, reversible, and aimed at inducing compliance with international law, which, as I mentioned earlier, a down payment on the existing debt would very much fall under that category. So unlike private property, sovereign assets that belong to a state that's engaging in this aggressor conduct that has violated the fundamental norms of the UN Charter, it does not enjoy absolute immunity. That is just factually true under the law. This would not be breaking the rules of international law. In fact, this would be reinforcing them because there is a measure and a mechanism of enforcement under international law, because otherwise it's useless. So that's the legal part of it. I do agree that it's largely bureaucrats who don't want to do difficult things and who see this as an economic issue, but not as a national security issue. The legal mechanisms have been thrown around quite frequently. Well, we don't know how to do it. What would this be? Well, there are proposals out there. And for example, one of those is to establish a trust fund where these assets could be held out of the reach of Hungary's and Slovakia's veto and set aside for victims of Russia's invasion. So this would be a trust fund would function with countries that currently hold the assets as trustees. So they would be holding those assets on behalf of the victims. They would not be seizing it for themselves. That is a clear distinction. So when we use words like seizure, confiscation, we use them interchangeably, but legally it's a matter of transfer. It is transferring on behalf of victims where that is the only lawful place for them to go. That's either to Russia or to the victims. So another objection, I think, is often that is, well, how do we protect Belgium? How do we protect Euroclear from legal action? This would be very expensive for Belgium if the Russians sued, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's something else that these assets can be used for. We can indemnify Belgium and Euroclear by setting aside a certain amount in an escrow account to indemnify Belgium and Euroclear against any legal action that can be taken. Additionally, we can also, once these assets are put into a trust fund to hold them, first of all, keep them safe, we can also manage them more efficiently. Right now, they are parked, and probably Timothy can speak to this more than I can, but they are losing value. They're being reinvested at overnight rates. But if we put them into that trust fund, they can be managed more efficiently, more effectively, and generate more income for the victims. Another point, I would say, Tim brought this up about taxpayers, is it's for victims of Russia's aggression, it is fundamental that it is the aggressor that compensates and pays. They don't just need money, they need money from the aggressor. That is a core part of reparations. So even if European taxpayers would be paying that compensation, you lose that reparations portion of it. It needs to be Russia that pays for its unlawful invasion.
I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Tim, because the next topic is going to be, well, what happens if these funds do seed back? How could they affect, Russia's war machine? Because we have declining oil prices. On the other hand, we have the US administration making noises about it being open to various trade arrangements, and the fairly ludicrous suggestion that Nord Stream 2 could be fired up again. What would 200 billion do at this state of play for the Russian war machine with all the other variables that seem to be up in the air?
Well, again, just to go back to what Yuliya said, I mean, there are solutions. There are legal solutions. There are economic solutions. I mean, okay, the ERA was a bit of a stopgap kind of solution. I mean, I was opposed to the ERA at the outset because I think in the end it took momentum away from seizing the underlying asset, right? A year and a half ago, when we were talking about this, the ERA came up and it threw the whole issue of confiscation of the underlying asset into the long grass, right? And we're now in a situation where actually the ERA itself is at threat. As Yuliya mentioned, G7 countries will be on the hook for about 50 billion, which is a ridiculous situation. There were lots of solutions. You know, Ukraine could have issued a bond. The underlying asset could have been used to buy the bond. Russia would have still had ownership of the underlying assets. Again, you could have put the funds in higher interest bearing accounts, an EM portfolio, which you could have generated 8 to 10% return. In the end, it's been a failure of leadership, right, from our politicians. That's at the core of it. They found lots of reasons not to do what they should have done. And, you know, if you think about this, obviously there's a lot of focus on the Trump presidency and the US or the MAGA guys complaining about the cost of supporting Ukraine, right? Imagine if 3 years ago, we'd have confiscated the 300 billion and used them to support Ukraine, then the MAGA guys would not have been able to say that all this money has been wasted, their taxpayer money has been wasted on supporting Ukraine. That political argument that's been used now to undermine support for Ukraine would not be there, right? So our leaders, unfortunately, installing doing this, have actually been part of undermining political support for Ukraine itself in terms of its defense and our defense. So, by not doing what they should have done, they've actually made the situation much worse. And actually, we're at this point where Ukraine is going to negotiations in a very difficult position, being pushed perhaps to agree things that it doesn't really want to do, because in the end we didn't do this when we should have done it. In terms of the question you've asked, I mean, it's 300 billion overall in broader jurisdictions. And I imagine if the Europeans, if we don't again do what we need to do to make sure sanctions rollover happens in July, I'd imagine the Trump administration also will do the same. So potentially it's a 300 billion back to Russia. That's a lot of buying power on international markets in terms of buying key military technology, dual-use goods, all those kind of things that help it regenerate its military capability. And let's not forget that Russia is threatening both Ukraine and Europe, right? Rolling over sanctions in Europe, at least, should be in Europe's own interests. And I think European politicians finally understand that this threat to Ukraine, Russia is not only threatening Ukraine, he's threatening Europe. And I think we've seen that in commentary from the new German Chancellor. I think actually encouragingly across the board from UK Prime Minister Starmer, Macron in France, the Scandis, etc. I mean, they finally all understand, right, that even if Trump, Freudian slip, even if Trump cuts a deal with Putin, the threat from Russia to Europe will remain. Now, if Russia gets those $300 billion dollars of assets back, again, it will be able to regenerate its military capability to threaten Europe, and that's again a huge existential threat to Europe. Europeans should make sure that doesn't happen.
Yuliya, does that accord with your understanding of the threat there? And how would that degrade Ukraine's ability? Or would it simply elongate the war out for more years?
Well, yes, absolutely. 300 billion is enough to probably fund the Russian war for another 10 years. It gives Russia money to rearm itself. There was just today, the Wall Street Journal, and not just this is not just military action against Ukraine. Let's note that. Just today, the Wall Street Journal reported that Russia is building up its military infrastructure on the border of Finland. This aligns with what Russia has been doing in terms of its hybrid attacks on Nordic countries, including Finland. Experts have been saying that we've predicted this potential NATO confrontation, but this is accelerating faster than we could have predicted. So Russia is already gearing up for this. This is a very, very real threat, which NATO has been warning about for us for years. So this not only gives Russia the money to pay back its debt, which currently it has about, incidentally, 300 billion on off-book debts. It's giving Russia money to keep waging its war against Ukraine, even if there's some sort of ceasefire. We've seen throughout history that Russia breaks every single ceasefire, so it will not abide by that. And it will continue on its imperialistic conquest throughout the rest of Europe. So we are not only removing those funds from Ukraine to help defend, to rebuild, we are giving Russia that money. That's a historic failure. That's a geopolitical disaster, and it would be one of our own making.
And with absolutely potentially dire consequences. I mean, given the conversations on this channel, I think that Timothy would share. I mean, the risk from Russia is huge, and indeed, its ambition is far exceeds its military capability. In fact, to inflict that ambition, it seems to me. What sort of lobbying might work at this stage, and where is the pressure point for potentially either, rolling this fund over, which of course is not the best outcome, handing it over with the best outcome, but in the short term at least, rolling it over, is that the best possible outcome? And what are the chances of being successful in that, Timothy?
Well, I mean, in managing the Hungary relationship, the Commission has been, I guess, quite innovative in the end. Orban has on numerous occasions threatened to block sanctions. So, I mean, the European Commission has some leverage, right? I mean, I think Hungary's gets around 23 billion euros in structural fund flows. Orban is facing a difficult election next year. He's not very popular, or he's popular. Well, actually, for the first time, there is a challenger in this guy Magyar, who was part of the Fidesz kind of party and community, right? And the Hungarian economy is in a difficult place; it's not growing. So the European has some leverage. He will extract concessions. I assume he'll try and extract softer conditionality around those EU funds to give him some money to spend in the run-up to those elections, which is ironic given that Orban is such a critic of the European Union, and yet he's first to the gravy to ride the gravy train of the European Union funds. So, I mean, let's hope there. But and there are also lots of other measures, alternative means whereby individual countries themselves, I guess, could could maintain the immobilization. And I think Yuliya probably has a better idea of that than me. I mean, one thing that, again, it's just extraordinary the number of good ideas that have been brought up and have been failed. I mean, again, thinking of the politics of all this in the Trump presidency, it's just beyond me why, European countries didn't pledge, and Ukraine was supportive, right? European countries did not pledge to use some of this money to buy US weapons to defend Ukraine, right? I mean, if that had been done, if we'd have organized ourselves in Europe to pitch to the Trump presidency very early in its term that a big number, 100 billion or something like that, of this immobilized assets would be used to purchase US weapons. I think the whole negotiation debate at the moment we're having with Putin would be somewhat different, right? I mean, the key for Ukraine in terms of its peace talks is security. If we had used this money to ensure that Ukraine could buy weapons from the US, and that's creating jobs in the US, Trump maybe wouldn't have taken such a pro-Russian sort of position in terms of these negotiations. Again, European leaders, missed a great opportunity, right? So, I mean, again, maybe there is still some opportunity to go back that to pledge the use of some of these resources again to buy US weapons going forward. They're big numbers, right? They could assure or create lots of US jobs.
And potentially, Putin stepped into that vacuum to suggest alternative uses. For instance, reviving the Russian air fleet by Boeing is one of the ideas that was floated. So this has created an opportunity for Putin to become a kind of Trump whisperer, let's say. Yuliya, what's your take on this? I mean, where do we need to go from now in order to get these funds unlocked? And how do you deal with the variable that is Trump?
Well, one thing is very clear. It's that this wait and see strategy that we've been doing for the past 3 years, renewing sanctions every 6 months, is no longer tenable. It wasn't tenable to begin with, but now this is coming to a head. We are quickly approaching an iceberg. The EU has already pulled a rabbit out of a hat in the past few renewals, falling into Hungary's concessions, and at the 11th hour, renewing sanctions. But what's to say what will happen in July? So Europe and the rest of the G7 has fallen into the trap of overstating the risks of action while being oblivious to the risks of inaction. So sure, we could try to work with Hungary and try to pull a rabbit out of a hat again, but that is not a winning strategy, especially when we have Trump in the mix. So I would say the only foolproof way to make sure that these assets do not go back to Russia, which should be our priority at this point right now, is to transfer them into a compensation fund for Ukraine, remove them from Euroclear's control, and institute national sanctions over them. This is the only way to remove them from the 6-month veto. And that window is closing very, very fast. The good news is, however, that this is not difficult to do. There likely wouldn't even need to be additional legislation passed. For example, banks and countries can do this under existing bank regulation powers. For example, Belgium could use bank regulatory powers to demand that Euroclear segregate its accounts held on behalf of the Central Bank of Russia into discrete accounts that Belgium can impose its own sanctions over, and other countries can do the same. So there are ways forward, and this is the moment to do that. Once we lose that opportunity is gone, and history doesn't give us second chances. So we need to be acting now. In terms of how Trump fits into this, honestly, who's to say? It's a wild card. I am based in the US. I do work on Capitol Hill quite frequently, and myself and many other experts just simply don't know. The administration has not put forth a strategy for the use of these assets, but we need to be preparing for the worst. That is simply just the situation that we are in. So we need to be taking measures that actually at this point are not risky. They are well established, and it would be riskier to not take those measures.
So as leadership, I mean, to conclude there, just get a sort of last word from both of you. Is it really the lack of leadership, vision, and indeed not just a sense of urgency, but a sense of terror, which should be there in the face of Russian threats to, say, the Baltics, to European security. Are we just not scared enough at this point? And how do you explain that?
I mean, our leaders are very quick to get on the train to Kiev, right, and have a photo opportunity with Zelensky, right, and then they go home. I think for me, in reality, is they still don't really get the scale of the existential threat from Russia, right? I mean, it's not really, and there's an arrogance or an overconfidence in our ability to resist Russia, but at this stage, it doesn't look like we're winning, right? It looks like we're losing, and we're losing because our politicians don't think outside the box. In fact, they think inside multiple boxes that, you know, encourage them not to do the things that they need to do. I mean, Putin, pulls, he pulls all levers out to screw Ukraine and screw us. We need to wake up to the scale of the threat, right? And again, Yuliya and others have provided lots of solutions around the immobilized Russian asset issue, and so why don't our politicians get on and just do it, right? I mean, it's not good enough classic one is Rishi Sunak, right? Former UK Prime Minister, left office last month, wrote an opinion piece in The Economist supporting the use of immobilized Russian assets, their confiscation. Why didn't he do that when he's in his office, right? He was in power for, I don't know, 2 years, whatever it was. He do it? It's no good when you've left office, right? I mean, so we need proper leadership.
Yuliya, last word for you then. Are we not scared enough to take these essential actions that need to be taken?
Well, there's been this perception and hesitance from G7 in Europe to say, well, we're not at war with Russia. We don't want to take these actions. However, whether you like it or not, Russia is at war with you. So delaying is not a neutral act anymore at this stage. Delaying is complicity. And further waiting risks catastrophe, not just for Ukraine, but Europe itself. And this is really where we need leadership, because not only does Ukraine rely on this, it's the credibility of the EU itself. Because if we wait and if we don't act now, we lose far more than the frozen assets. We lose the principles upon which the EU's credibility and Europe's future actually depends. It would communicate to aggressors that if you simply wait long enough and tolerate a temporary inconvenience, then you will not be made to pay for the destructive actions and violations of international law. And that's something that would be catastrophic, not just for our current practical reality, but for our worldwide democracies moving forward.
That is a terrible precedent to set. For today, Yuliya and Timothy, thank you so much for coming on, especially on an issue of such vital importance. This is the first for the audience of 2 episodes on this topic this week, because it is of such a sort of urgent and immediate importance. But please do follow the work of both of our wonderful guests and the extraordinary things that they're doing. It will also help to inform you on these essential issues. For today, though, Yuliya and Timothy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Tim.
My pleasure.